This is the first Space Marine I ever painted, and as you can see, I put on a little bit too much paint here. I really gummed up all that detail, and the base is an absolute mess, but you know what? I had a lot of fun in painting this model, so much so, I'm still doing this hobby more than 25 years later. Now, at the time, there was no one out there really giving clear advice as to what to do. There was certainly no YouTube or anything like that, but nowadays, things are quite different. So in this video, what we're going to do is walk you through all the basic steps of painting your first miniature so you get a great result. So the first thing to do is, of course, to build your miniatures, and once they're built and ready, you can start painting them. And I've got the example that I'm going to be painting just here. This is a Space Marine Intercessor I built up, and what we need to do is start by putting an undercoat on here, which is also known as a primer. Now, this particular kind of paint is important because it's designed to stick to the plastic, then have other paint stick on top of that. So if you skip this step, what you'll find if you just put the regular acrylic paint on the plastic, they rub off quite easily. So it is an important step. Now, there are loads of different colours out here you can get, and there's loads of different manufacturers who make them, but if in doubt, I recommend you go for a grey spray. In fact, the one I'm going to use in this video is this one, which is Mechanicus Standard Grey from Citadel. Great starting point for almost any miniature, really. And what you need to do to use this stuff is to just get a way of holding the miniature whilst you spray it so you don't get the paint all over your hands. So for that reason, what I have here is an old stick. And to use this, just get some double-sided tape and just stick it on the end there. You can get your miniature, pop it on there, and then you're ready to go outside and spray. The next thing to do is give the can a good shake for around about 2 minutes and then start spraying your miniature from about 30 centimeters away. And the motion should just be back and forth across the miniature, making sure you get a nice even coating across all the detail. And once you've done so, give it about 10 or 15 minutes to dry. Once that undercoat is dry, you're then ready to start painting. So let's have a quick look at the equipment you're going to need. First thing is going to be just something to hold some water so you can wash your brushes. And for that reason, I have here a glass. So filled with water, ideal for that. Next thing is to have a palette. Now, this is just a white ceramic tile that I picked up from a hardware store for like 50p, but you could also use a white ceramic plate. This allows you to get your paint ready before you apply it onto the miniature, as you'll see in a moment. Now, next thing you should get hold of is some tissue paper. This is for drying the brushes and also helps us manipulate the paint a little bit as well, which again, you're going to see in a moment. But then what you're also going to need are some brushes. Now, there are 4 that I consider to be essential and an extra one that's a nice to have when you're getting started. The ones I've got here are all from Games Workshop, so they're all Citadel brushes, but other brands do make equivalents, so all you need is something like these, basically. So let's take a look at them. The first one is quite different from the other ones in that it's a totally different colour, but the bristles here are synthetic, and then they're quite rough and ready. This is a medium base coat brush, and it's designed for the base coating when you're starting out on your miniature. So you'll find the bristles do fray, but it covers ground very quickly, so it's ideal for that first step. The next brush is this one here. This is a medium shade brush. This one's designed for applying a particular kind of paint called a wash or a shade. It's a large brush, great for that sort of thing. So again, we'll see that in action soon. The next one is a dry brush. This is a small dry brush and it's designed for a technique called dry brushing. What makes it special is that it's very springy on the bristles, so it's going to be ideal for that technique, which we'll come to later on. The last 2 brushes are the real workhorses here. What we've got is a medium layer brush, which is this one here. This is one I consider to be essential. The other one is a small layer brush. So it's a very, very similar kind of brush, but you can just see it's a bit smaller. Makes it a bit easier to paint some fine detail on your miniatures. So it is optional, but great to have if you can get hold of one as well. So with that ready, what we now need to do is start by applying the paint to the miniature, and the first one we should use is going to be the medium base coat brush. So I'm going to be starting out with this, and for our Space Marine, we're going to paint him in the colours of the Ultramarines. So we want to start out with a nice deep rich blue to get things going. Now in this video, I'm mostly going to be using Tooth & Coats paints, but there are loads of different brands out there. Doesn't matter which one you go for, because this is more about the techniques than about the actual particular paint. So just look for a nice rich blue that you like. The one I'm going to be using here is Marine Blue. Now, no matter what brand you go for, first thing to do is to make sure you give the paint a really good shake, and this one's in a dropper bottle. You might have a flip cap instead on some brands. Same sort of thing though for each one of them. What you need to do is start out by getting some of this paint onto your palette. So I'm just going to put a little dollop there like that. And then what we can do is add a touch of water to this to thin the paint down, because usually straight out the bottle, a paint can be a little bit too thick, so it becomes quite easy to have it start clogging detail or leaving like lumpy appearances, brush marks, that sort of thing. So to avoid it, you just add a touch of water to it and it thins it and means you get a nicer result. It also means that generally what you'll want to do is apply it as Tooth & Coats, which you'll see in just a moment, but what we're going to do is start out by just getting it ready. So I have my medium base coat brush. Just going to get a little bit of water on it. Don't need loads. You can see I'm not dunking it in the water, literally just touching it to the surface there like that. And then what you do is put that next to your paint on the palette and start drawing the paint into it. So what I'm creating here is a mix of the paint just there of what I'm actually going to be using to put on the miniature. This is more a reserve where we can pull more paint into it as we need to, because at the moment it feels a little bit too thin, a little bit too runny. So I'm just going to mix in a bit more of the paint into that, stir it in thoroughly, and then we can test it on the palette. So just try painting it on there. You see, that's nice and smooth. It's a little bit translucent, but the important thing is that it's really smooth. So that's the result we're going to get on the miniature. I'm happy with that, which means we can start applying it. So just load up your brush, and then it's a matter of just getting it onto the model. And for this initial step, you don't have to worry about any fine detail. We just want to make sure that all the parts that we want to be blue are painted blue. So you can see this design on the chest. That's going to be gold later, but it doesn't matter for the time being. Just make sure all the surrounding armor is blue before you move on to the next step. Once that first coat is applied, if you look carefully, whilst the paint might be nice and smooth, in areas it hasn't distributed completely evenly, meaning that some of that undercoat is still showing through, such as on the leg right there. That's not a problem, because all you do is go in and apply a second thin coat of the exact same colour at the exact same mix with the water. Now, whilst at first glance this might appear that you've got to paint twice as much, the result is that you're going to get a much cleaner, neater finish to the paint, and also you're not going to get any details clogged up, whereas if you painted straight out the bottle, then you certainly would do. Here you can see the result of applying that second thin coat. We've now got a smooth, consistent blue, and all the detail is nice and sharp as well. So what's next? Well, the next thing to do is to get some shading on that blue, because now what we can do is move on to that second brush I showed you. So this is the medium shade brush, because with it we can apply a wash onto the miniature. Now, a wash paint is also known as a shade paint sometimes, and basically it's quite different from the regular paints in that it looks very inky, and it's designed to be painted over other colours and run into all the detail and give you instant shading. The result can be a little bit of murkiness on some raised up areas, but that's not a problem because we'll deal with that straight away once this wash is dry. Now for this miniature, what you'll need is a black wash. Again, there's loads of different brands out there. The one I'm going to be using is Oblivion Black Wash, and they all apply in more or less the same way. You don't have to thin these paints down with any water, but you do want to make sure you're applying with quite a large brush for the sort of quantity we're looking at applying just here. So for that reason, I'm using that medium shade brush that I introduced earlier on. And what you do is just load up a good generous amount there onto your brush and then start painting it directly over all that blue that we've just done. So if I start around here, for example, just going to start putting it on, poking it into all the corners, and you can see the inkiness of it here, but also because it's running into those corners, it's giving us shading in those areas. So all you'll need to do is just paint it all across the miniature like this. Now bear in mind, it is possible to put too much of this paint on, just like it's possible to put on too little. The sort of quantity I'm getting around about here in the middle of the body now is really what you're looking for, but it is easy just to get a bit carried away and put on loads. So for example, on his hand just here, you can end up putting it on like that. Now if it dries like that, what it will do is gum up all of that detail, so you've got to keep an eye out for it. If you spot it building up like that or running down the miniature and starting to pool, you just need to make sure you poke your brush at it like a sponge, soak away the excess paint, and then just redistribute it elsewhere around the model. So just keep an eye on it as it dries, because the paint can run. You want to make sure you avoid that happening. Once you have got it painted all over the blue armour, now give it plenty of time to dry. Because this paint's so inky, it will take longer than the other colours here, so make sure you leave it for at least 45 minutes before you move on to the next stage. Here you can see the result with that wash now completely dry, and if you look carefully you can see more of the black paint settled in the recessed details, so it really darkened them down and defined them and gave us that shading there on the miniature. But as I mentioned, it has darkened down some of the flat areas too. It's got a little bit murky on some parts, such as that plate just there. So what we now need to do is just fix that up, and then we can move further with a lighter shade of blue to highlight the miniature. So to do this, we're now going to use that technique I mentioned earlier called dry brushing. Now dry brushing is essentially a matter of getting a bit of paint on your brush, then wiping away excess paint and making the brush dry, hence the name of it. And so long as you then apply it onto the miniature correctly, what will happen is the brush will only catch raised up areas and won't fall into recesses, meaning what you can do is start to get quick highlights on your model really easily, and also clean up colours too. So to do this, we're going to use two shades of blue. The first one needs to be that original blue we used, so in our case that's marine blue, and then what you'll need is a lighter shade of blue. I'm going to use some Elysian blue for this. We'll start out with marine blue, and now we need that dry brush. So it's that small dry brush I introduced earlier on. I've got a little blob of the paint just here, which I'm not thinning down with any water. All you need to do is get a little bit on the end of your brush there like that, and then get some dry tissue paper and start rubbing the brush on it while slowly turning it to make sure you get to all the paint. And what we're doing is really working it into the bristles and removing excess paint. Now if you look, I'm gradually moving the brush along to the right so I can see what sort of strength of paint I'm getting. When you're down to about that sort of appearance there on the texture of the paper, you're then ready to start applying it. And all you need to do is just start flicking it back and forth across the miniature. So if we go for the leg just here, all I'm going to do is brush like this. And you can see I'm moving fairly quickly. If I go a little bit slower, you can see I'm just going like that and then like that. But basically what I'm doing with this pace is allowing the brush to just slide over the surface of the miniature, but not giving it time to fall into the recessed detail. So if you look at this leg now, I've just cleaned up that blue, but I've still got the shading in the corners. So now it's just a matter of doing this all across the miniature. With that stage now done, you can see we've re-established that blue on the flat armor panels whilst also retaining the shading in the recessed corners. And so we can now move on to adding a highlight with a dry brush again, this time with a lighter blue, so I'm using some Elysium blue. Now when you're setting up to do this, you can use the same dry brush, but a really important thing to do is to make sure the brush bristles are completely dry before you start to do this, else it'll leave behind some quite streaky marks. Then set it up just like we did before on the tissue paper and then start to apply it. This time though, the application needs to be just a little bit lighter so that we catch raised corners. And so you can see whilst I'm still flicking it across the miniature, I'm just making sure to keep this sort of distance away on the bristles so that it just gently catches those edges and helps pick them out. All you do is a quick once around the miniature like this, and see what happens is we start to get that lighter colour catching the edges and corners and really helping them stand out. Now that we've completed doing that dry brushing, you can see all the detail is popping out really nicely. And we've got a really nice contrast between the lighter parts and the darker parts, so on the tabletop the model is going to look great. And so with all that done, we can now move on to the next phase of painting him, which is to start to pick out all the smaller details. So the plan here is to start working through a few colours which we can neatly apply into various details in the miniature, and then once they're all on there, we can apply some wash over all of them at the same time to give them some shading. Now you might think to yourself, well, why not do that in the first place and start out with that blue, put the other colours on there and then wash everything at the same time. The reason is because of that dry brushing that we've just done. As you've seen, it's basically impossible to really control it with any accuracy and avoid various other colours. So it's a good idea to do it early on and then neatly start applying other colours afterwards. So that's why we're keeping all these parts separate. So what we're going to do is start out by picking out all the black details. Here I'm using an off black that we can shade down with that wash later on. So what we're going to go for here is some Death Reaper. So this way we get some shading and some definition just like we did on the blue. With that done, we can then base coat all the leather with a dark brown. Going to use some Scorched Earth for this. And then finally we need to pick out all the silver. Here I'm going to go for some Cerakote Silver. But we're going to start out with the black, so this is some Death Reaper, and this is where those regular size brushes really come into play here. So I'm going to use the medium layer brush. If you have that small layer brush as well, you might want to keep that on hand for some of the finer details. The choice is yours. But with this brush, what we're now able to do is use the accuracy it gives to start to neatly block in these details. So what we need to do is thin this down just like we did with the blue paint in the first place. So you can see I'm just getting a little bit of water on my brush just there. Don't need loads and loads. I'm going to put it next to the black on the palette and start drawing that black paint in just like we did with the blue, just to start mixing it and getting it to that smooth consistency where it's going to apply easily onto the miniature. So you just need to gradually draw more paint in until it feels right. You can always test it on the palette to see how smoothly it applies. That looks pretty good, so I'm happy with that. And now, before we put it on the miniature, there's a really important step we need to go through, because right now there's too much paint in the brush, and if you look closely at it, you can see it's sort of bulging. Basically, when it's like that, it's really hard to control it in the model, and so mistakes become quite easy. So what we need to do on your tissue paper is just twist your brush along it there like that, and what this does is pushes out the excess paint from the brush and narrows the bristles together. So now we're getting a bit more control. With that done, just make sure you load up a small amount on there, because normally that's quite powerful in removing excess paint, so you can go a little bit too far. Just want to get a little bit more there on your brush and then put it quite flat to the palette and just twist it as you draw it along. And what this does is just make sure you have the correct quantity of paint in there, and it also brings the bristles to a nice point. Whilst at first glance that might seem like a bit of a waste of time and a waste of paint, it's actually really, really important, because now we have accuracy and control over the brush, meaning that applying these base coats is going to be much easier. It's far easier to be neat this way, you see. So with that prepared, we can start blocking these parts in. The first thing to look for are any joints in the armour. There's some nice obvious ones on the back of the legs. We're looking at things like these ridges just here. Here you can see having a brush like this is ideal, because it's very easy just to poke it in there and introduce this colour into that region and block in that joint with that black. Just take your time and just be as neat as possible. You can see how I'm holding my hands, just bracing them together, making sure they're always in contact, and this helps minimize any shakes. If you're struggling with any shakes, just brace yourself right down on the table and that'll help out with that. But just really take your time, especially on narrower parts like just here, where you can see again having that fine point in the brush from the work we did on the palette really helps out, because we can get it right into that corner just down there. So for this step, we're looking for all those joints around the armor. Also, if your miniature is like us, where he's not wearing a helmet, you might want to paint his hair black. So I'm certainly going to do so just up here. And also we've got the outer casing on the bolt rifle to do, which is this upper surface that goes along here, along with the grip just down here. I finished with the black now, which, just like with the blue, I applied as 2 thin coats to make sure it's nice and smooth and has an even coverage over any colours that would be beneath it. And so with that done, we can move on to the next colour, which is going to be a dark brown. I'm using some scorched earth here, and this is for anything leather, like this little pouch just here. We've also got his belt to do, his holster, there's the gun strap just here. All these parts just need to be blocked in at this stage. Now the paint has been prepared in the exact same way as what I did with the black, and just like with the black, take your time and be as neat as possible on this stage. And then finally, it's time to base coat the silver detail with our first metallic paint for the miniature, and that is going to be Cerakote Silver in this case, which I'm still applying using that medium layer brush. Now, the silver details can be a little bit intricate, so do take your time, and if you do happen to make any mistakes, don't worry about it, because you can always revert back to one of the previous colours and use it to tidy up before you continue. Because see, it's going to be mechanical details such as the magazine down here on the bolt rifle. On the backpack, we've got all the vents and things around here that we need to get as well. Now, despite being shiny, this paint is still just like a regular acrylic paint, so it still thins down with water in just the same way as all the previous ones, and is applied in the same way as well. With that, we've now finished applying those base coat colours that can share that wash, so it's time to move on to applying that wash. And before you do this, you may notice now in your water, you have a few little bits of metal flecks floating around inside it, and that's because this is how the metallic paints work. Basically, they have small bits of metal floating around inside them, and this can get into your paint water, and if you're not careful, this can then contaminate other colours. So when you use a load of metallics, it's a good idea afterwards to wash your water out and get some fresh water and carry on from there. Once that's done, you are then ready for that next paint, which is that wash, and a black wash is again ideal here. So I'm going to use Oblivion Black Wash once again. And this time we just need to neatly apply it over these new colours that we've added since we did that dry brushing. So for that reason, I'm going to be applying the wash this time using my medium layer brush. If you have that small layer brush, you might want to use that as well. The choice really is yours. But in doing this, use your palette again to gauge exactly how much is on the brush, because like when we were base coating earlier, it's possible to have too much on there like I have here, in which case the bristles start to bulge out and you'll lose that accuracy. So when you're doing the finer areas, just twist away excess paint off there on your palette to make sure you get that point on your brush. Then with this, we now need to apply it over these new colours that we've added. So for example, on the black, we've got the joints just here. You can see why it's important to make sure your brush isn't overloaded, because we just want to introduce it over that joint right there so it flows into the recesses and gives us the shading just like it did on the blue armour earlier on. Now, there are some parts where it's much easier to get to these areas, such as on the bolter, in which case you can be a little bit more generous with the paint on the brush to get it over this area quickly, but when you get close to that blue armour, just really take your time and be as neat as possible so as not to get the wash on that area. With that second application of the wash dry, we've now got shading on those other colours, which really stands out very nicely, especially on the silver details just around there. But with that done, we can now move on to applying 2 more base coats in the miniature. The reason why we've kept these separate from the ones we've just done is because they're going to use a different colour for the wash over the top. And so here what we're looking at is some gold followed by a flesh for the head. So we're going to start out with some dragon's gold here, followed by some elven skin. So quite a pale tone for the skin there, which we're going to wash down as you'll see. But we'll start out with that gold. So here I'm using some dragon's gold, and to apply it, I'm again going for that medium layer brush, because the base coating here is basically the same sort of techniques as what we've just been doing with things like the silver and the black and the leather. What we've got to do is start out by getting the paint thinned down with that touch of water on the palette. So you can see this metallic is just like a regular acrylic paint, and thinning it down. Just gradually pulling some of that paint into the water just to adjust the mix until it's nice and smooth. Always test it on the palette, and that's looking pretty good. And remember, the key thing is to make sure you don't go onto the miniature with too much paint in your brush, because if you do, it's very easy to lose control of it. So for that reason, I'm just going to get rid of that excess paint there off on the tissue, and then just go in, draw up fresh, making sure to twist my brush just to bring the bristles to a nice point, and this way we'll have that accuracy. So now it's time to look for the details we need to pick out with gold. The main one is going to be this wing design that appears on the chest. So we're just going to start out with the skull right there, then move out to the wings. When you're doing the wings, just really take your time and resist the temptation to go at it too heavily, because it can be a little bit tricky getting the paint in amongst these feather designs. But if you do go too heavy on it, it's very easy to splash onto the surrounding armour. So just really take your time on that part. We've also got the rims on the shoulder plates to do, and when it comes to these, because they stand out, what you can do is approach them with the side of the brush like this and just gently skim along the raised up detail, and this way it's very easy to get that neat line on them. Just gradually build up that colour there like that. Finally, on the bolter, there's usually a little device on there that needs to be picked out with gold. In this case, we've got this scroll just here, so we just want to carefully go in and pick this out as well. And once that's done, it's then time to base coat the skin, and here I'm using quite a pale skin tone, so this is some elven skin, and because it's quite a light colour going over a darkish grey, just bear in mind when you're doing something like this, you will definitely need to apply it as at least 2 thin coats, possibly 3, but just be sure to keep them nice and thin so all the detail stays really sharp. Now that we've got the skin base coated too, it's time to wash both these colours. So we're looking at the skin and the gold here. And in this case, we're actually going to use a different kind of paint. We're going to use one of Citadel's contrast paints, which at first glance looks just like a wash. And it certainly behaves a lot like a wash, but actually it's a bit different because generally it's a bit more intense. And so it will tend to stain areas that you paint it over much more than a wash does. Now this has all sorts of useful applications. And as you go further in the hobby, you're certainly going to discover all kinds of cool things you can do with it. But in our case, it's going to work really nicely over the skin and over the gold as well. It's going to make it really warm and really rich. The colour I'm going to be using is Guilliman Flesh, and to apply it I'm going to be using that medium layer brush again. You might want to go for the small layer brush if you have one, but whatever the case, just get this onto your palette, and just like when we were carefully applying that black wash earlier, you need to use the palette to make sure your brush isn't overloaded here so it doesn't run out of control. So use tissue as you need to and load up from the palette, and then it's a matter of painting this straight over the skin and over that gold as well. Now I'll start out on the skin, and all you got to do is just go in there with your brush and just paint it directly over the top, and you'll see what happens is it stains it and gives it a really nice tone. Same's going to be true when you get to the gold. Simply just paint it straight over the top and then give the model around about 5 or 10 minutes to dry. Once that contrast paint is completely dry, you can see the finished result, and in fact you could just paint the base of your miniature now with some textured paint, and on the tabletop it's going to look fantastic. And trust me, if you paint an army up to this standard, it's going to look great. But if you do want to take it a little bit further, you can do, and this is entirely optional, but what we can do is just pick out a few features just to emphasize them a bit more and make them pop on the tabletop. If you want to do this, we'll start by adding some detail to the face. Now for this, first of all, we're going to return to that original color that we applied. So in our case, that's going to be elven skin, and what we'll do is just pick out a few details to highlight them. Then, because he's got gritted teeth here, you can paint the teeth if you want to. In this case, you'll want a light bone colour, so I'm going to use some Vampire Fang in this case. But we'll start out with that elven skin, and this is where that optional brush really comes in. I'm going to be using the small layer brush for this for the maximum control here, because what we want to do is just use this colour just to pick out certain details. So as usual, I'm going to get some water and draw that paint into it, but this time I'm just going to add a bit more water than what we have been using for those original base coats. The reason is because I want to make the paint a little bit translucent. So you can see that's the case on the palette here. You can see the palette through it. And once you've got that thinned down, the thing to do is just like when we're applying the base coats, remove away that excess paint because it's very easy to overdo this. You don't need very much. Just load up that small amount on your brush, just like before, twist it to make sure you've got that nice point on your brush. Then with this, there are just a few little details that you need to touch the paint onto. The first of these is going to be down the bridge of the nose, so we just want to make sure we just get this little line down there like that. Next thing is going to be the brows, so just with the tip of the brush a little bit along there and just a little bit along there. Then we can get the cheekbones too, so just in here, and then finally we want to get the chin down here. Next up, we have another optional step, which is to pick out the teeth as this guy is gritting them. So here what you'll want is a pale bone colour. I'm using some Vampire Fang, and with that small layer brush again, just very gently go in and just dot them in there like that. With that little feature done, you can see it adds a lot of character to the miniature, and so what we'll do now is turn our attention to this gold, because whilst we've got some lovely shading on it, the effect of the contrast paint is that it does matte it down quite a lot, and you might want to bring some of that shine back to it. Now if you do want to, all you need to do is go back to that original gold that you used, so here it's going to be Dragon's Gold, and we're going to apply it again using that small layer brush, but this time in quite a controlled fashion. We're looking for the parts that are raised up and stand out, and just want to be careful to avoid the recessed parts where more of that contrast paint settled. So to do it, it's going to be setting up just like we did on the face just now, where we thin that paint down, just like before, thin it down like that. So it's a little bit thinner than it would be when you were base coating, and then just make sure to remove that excess paint off on the tissue so that your brush isn't overloaded. You don't need very much of this, so we just want to load up like this so you can see it's actually not very much on the brush at all. but it's good because then we got that fine point on there. And with this, we now just look for those parts that are standing out. Now, the biggest example is going to be the skull in the middle of the chest, where we're just going to do its forehead, just a little bit of that colour there, and then just a little bit around where the teeth are. So just there. If you want to do the wings as well, just look towards the top of them. So we're looking at areas like the pinions just here. Just a little flash of that colour on there, just to bring that shine into those parts that stand out. And then on the shoulder pad rims, if you want to do these two, again, just look towards the top of them and just apply a thin coat along here. And here we have the result of that gold being reapplied. You can see the shine's been returned to it, whilst also retaining that definition that we got from the contrast paint. And so with that done, it's now time to do the base of the miniature. Now, when it comes to basing the model, well, this is a massive subject. In fact, it can be an entire hobby in itself, and it's also really, really fun to bring landscapes to life on the bases of your models. But when starting out, it's a good idea just to go for something nice and straightforward, so texture paint is ideal for this kind of thing. There are a load of different colours you can go for here, so a good rule of thumb is that if your miniature is quite dark, you should go for a lighter base. Whereas if your miniature is light, you should go for a darker base, because what this does is provides a nice contrast between the two. For our example, what I'm going to go for is kind of an urban style base, so sort of rubble is what I'm looking for here. So I'm going to use a grey texture paint, and I've got one from Citadel. It's called Astrogranite, and what we want to do is just scoop it and put it onto the base of the miniature. Now, this kind of paint has texture in the paint itself, so this is something that's really important to note, because some of that texture will get in amongst the bristles of the brush that you use, which means if you use a good brush, it's going to start to fray it and it can ruin the brush. So whatever you do, don't use your good brushes here. Instead, you just want some cheap old ones, or even a coffee stirrer or something like that. Don't go for something massive like a toothbrush, because you do need some accuracy here. So my top pick here would be an old cheap brush that's around about the same size as your medium layer brush. That's precisely what I've got here. This is an old regiment brush from the army painter that I like to use for this sort of thing. And you can see I've got the paint just here. All you need to do is get a good scoop to start out with, and then just blob it onto the base, a nice open space. So I like to go for the middle around about here. Just put it on there and start pushing it around. You can see why it's important to have some control over it here, because you need to be careful as you get close to the feet of your miniature. You want to go up to the feet, but not actually onto them. So just up there like that. And once you have coated the top of the base with a good generous amount, give it at least an hour to dry. Once that paint is completely dry, you can see you're left with a really nice texture ground there on the miniature. And so now we have a great opportunity just to add a bit of detail on here to break the colour up a little bit. Now, there's lots and lots of things you could do, but a great easy thing to do when you're starting out is to put some grass tufts on there. And there are loads of companies that make these, but they all follow the same general principles. They all look quite similar too. I've got some here from Gamers Grass, so this is their swamp packet. I think this one's good because it's a nice sort of murky dark green, which I think will suit the base nicely, but there's loads and loads of colours you can get out there. There's all flowers and all kinds of different things. But to use these, all you've got to do is just get them out of the packet, and you'll see they have this backing paper on them. You just need to get yourself a pair of tweezers, and what you do is just pick one. So for example, this one right here, just grab it and then just peel it off the back. Now the underside there is sticky, so all you need to do is decide where you want it on the base and just put it on there and then press it down, and there you go. It's up to you exactly how many of these you then add. Now once you're happy with that, the last thing to do is to paint the rim of the base, and this could be any colour that you want, but it's usually a good idea to go with something that's going to match what's on the surface of the base. So I think in this case, black is going to work really well, so I'm just going to paint that with some Death Reaper. And so congratulations, if you've been following along, you've now just painted your first ever miniature, and as you've seen, it's really not all that hard. So as you've seen, when it comes to painting miniatures, really it comes down to a number of core techniques that really revolve around using your palette correctly and making sure your brush is loaded up correctly. So remember that depending on what sort of paint you're using, you might need to thin it down with a bit of water to make sure it is nice and smooth so that it applies correctly onto the model. And then when you're getting it actually ready on the brush, just remember not to overdo it. You don't need tons and tons of paint, just get it to the right point and suddenly you'll find it actually becomes quite straightforward to get it to go where you want it to go. Now, even though we painted an ultramarines colour scheme for the Space Marine we used for our example here, the actual methods we've used can be applied to any sort of chapter you might want to paint for Space Marines, or indeed any miniature at all. The same techniques can still be applied even though the colours might be different. So if you've never tried it before, I definitely encourage you to give it a go, because from here you can learn all sorts of cool extra techniques and really the world is your oyster. So have fun, and we'll see you again very soon.